Okay, so this is what I want to cover in the next few minutes. And again, I welcome your questions that you can put in the chat box, either during or certainly at the end. I want to just make the point real briefly that this isn't the federal system and why that's different. Different states have different ways that they select and retain judges. We'll talk briefly about those, but really focus mostly on Indiana. Quick history of how things have changed in Indiana. And then I really want to talk about what's on the ballot, which are, there's an Indiana Supreme Court justice and 6 judges on the Court of Appeals. And depending on what county you are, there may be elections or retention elections, and focus, because a lot of people are in Marion County, on the retention election that's happening in Marion County. So a lot of people are probably interested in what's happening with the US Supreme Court. There was just a vote today in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Judges on the US Supreme Court and in the federal court system are appointed for life. So you don't have a direct way, at least as a voter, to weigh in whether you're happy or unhappy with who's on the US Supreme Court in terms of how they get there and whether they stay there. The way that happens is by electing presidents and electing senators. Is indirectly you have some say in what happens with the Supreme Court. That's true of the US Supreme Court, the federal appellate courts, and then there are 94 district courts with a few hundred judges around the country. And all of those are appointed for life. That's because the US Constitution says that. And that's very different from the state systems where most judges are not appointed for life. Go to this map first. So this shows the different ways. And in some states, there are different ways for the state Supreme Court and the trial courts. And I think this focuses on the state Supreme Courts. There's what's called merit selection, or a nominating commission with retention elections. And if you look at the light blue states, which includes Indiana and a lot of states in the middle of the country, including Missouri, where this Missouri plan was created, do this system of having judges appointed, and then they have to run for retention a few years after appointed, and then usually about every 10 years after that. Some states, including our neighboring states on all sides, have elections. So if you're from one of those states or have seen TV ads, a lot of money ends up getting spent. And in some states, it's a really ugly kind of system where people really go at each other, and a lot of money ends up being spent for elections, whether they be partisan, or it's Democrat or Republican, like in Texas and Illinois, or in Ohio and Michigan and Kentucky. The ballot does not say Democrat or Republican, although usually there's the 2 candidates that end up on the ballot are sort of understood that one party's supporting each one, even if it doesn't say so on the ballot, if you look at where the money's coming from and who's sort of promoting those candidates. What's the role of judges? And different people are going to have different views of this. And my goal today is to sort of tell you what's on the ballot, give you some information about how you can research it, and not to tell people how they're supposed to vote. But the idea behind retention elections is that you can have an independent judiciary, but there's some accountability. True independence is the federal system, a lifetime appointment, or some of the states in the Northeast that still have lifetime appointments. But with retention elections or any kind of elections, there's some sort of measure of accountability. How people exercise that varies. Some people maybe want to just vote for judges who were appointed by a Democrat or a Republican, or people that have a certain view on abortion or a different issue, or that the liberal or conservative label applies to. So different people are going to take different views of that. But in retention elections, some of these things are harder to discover. So if you haven't voted yet, when you do vote, this is the ballot, a sample ballot in Marion County. You're going to go through and, president and Congress and some different offices. And then towards the end, the back of the sample ballot, or if you voted person electronically, several pages at the end, are all these judges. And I know a lot of people are surprised by that. They weren't sort of anticipating that. If you even talked to some law students in the last week as I prepared for this, and a lot of them were even surprised that they get to the end of this and here's all these judges. What should I do? So that's what I want to spend the rest of the time on. But here, this is not even the whole ballot. This is part of the ballot that shows you, and this is what it asks you. It says, shall these judges be retained in office? You vote yes or no, and there's several of these. So in Indiana, the court system, we have a Supreme Court with 5 justices, and then a Court of Appeals with 15 judges. And then 300 some trial judges, and there's various other courts, but that's how the court system's set up. And before 1970 in Indiana, all judges were elected on a partisan ballot. So if someone wanted to serve on the Supreme Court, they would go to the Republican or Democratic convention. They would be selected by the party. They would raise money. When there was a general election, a lot of times whoever won governor would also win Supreme Court if they were from the same party. That's what happened for most of Indiana history up to 1970. And judges a lot of times would only serve one term, because depending on what party they were, if the governor's office changed, which in Indiana history did change quite a bit, the Supreme Court justices would get voted out in the process. And so it wasn't a job with necessarily a lot of security, and that affects the kind of people who want to engage in that process. If you know you're going to have to raise a lot of money, give up your practice, and then maybe in 4 or 6 years, you're not going to have a job anymore. So the idea in 1970 was to go to this merit selection process, to take some of the politics and the fundraising and all of that out of it. And this required the General Assembly to vote for this 2 different times. And then the voters had to vote and approve this. And in 1970, the voters approved a constitutional amendment, had a lot of different provisions, but the ones relevant to what we want to talk about today are that vacancies are filled by the governor from a list of nominees that come from a 7-member nonpartisan commission. And then after the person served for at least 2 years, and then every 10 years after that, they have to face retention. And they need to get at least 50% in Indiana. Some states, a few require 60. In Indiana, it's 50. And I can tell you up front, and for the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court, every judge and justice has been retained. The trial level, it's a little bit different. So in trial courts, the General Assembly gets to choose the method. And most counties, as we'll talk about at the end, there are partisan elections still. Marion County has a merit selection and retention process that happened just recently. A couple other counties do too. So as far as what's going to be on the ballot for you, when you vote in the next few days or a couple weeks, Justice Goff, one of the 5 people in the Supreme Court who was appointed a few years ago, this is the first time he's up for retention. So he's on the ballot, and I have a slide here in a minute I'll show you with the retention website that gives you information. But one of the justices in the Supreme Court, the other ones in the next 10 years will all be up again as well. Again, it's every 10 years, but the first time after at least 2 years they have to run. The Court of Appeals has 15 judges, 6 of those are on the ballot. And it's sort of odd how this is set up, but I have a little diagram in the bottom right corner that shows there are these different districts. So none of you will be able to vote for all 6 of them. Depending on what district you're in, you'll vote for a few of them. If they're from the 4th or 5th district, which a couple of them are, everybody in the state gets to vote for those. But if they're in district 1, 2, or 3, you have to live in that district. So for example, if you're in Indianapolis, if you look at the 2nd district, Judge Bradford's from the 2nd district, so you'll be able to vote for him. But Judge Tavitas is from the 3rd district, so you won't be able to vote for her. These are the judges who are on the ballot someplace in Indiana. Justice Goff everywhere. The 4th and 5th district Court of Appeals judges everywhere. I'm gonna pull up this website. I think I'm gonna need to do a new share for you to be able to see this. So this is the retention website that the courts have put together. And I think Isra's going to put this in the chat as well so that you can see this if you want. This lists all the judges who are up for retention, has biographical information about them, and then it also has every written opinion and videos from oral arguments. And that's for some of these judges who've been serving for 20 or more years, can be a lot of opinions and a lot of oral arguments. But if you want to learn more about who's on the ballot, you can read the biographical information. If you want to read some of their opinions or look at the oral arguments, you can look at those as well. That's the court's website that has all of that information on it. So now we'll go back here. Another piece of information that you might be interested in is what lawyers think of the different people who are on the ballot. And so there's a bar association in Indiana. It's not required that lawyers join the state bar association, but about half the lawyers in the state do join. and they did a poll. The response rate was not particularly strong, but 9% of the lawyers responded, and overwhelmingly, all the lawyers thought that all of the judges who are up for retention should be retained. And you can see the numbers here. There's not a lot of variation between 83 and 85%. There's a link there that I guess will tell you a little bit more, but there's not a whole lot. There weren't multiple questions, which some bar associations do, which is, to ask you to assess them on different sort of grounds, like, the quality of their opinions, or for trial judges, how they treat litigants, some of those things. There's not any of that. It's just should this person be retained or not? And you see those results. So you maybe are wondering, why haven't I seen advertising? If these judges are up for retention elections, if they lose their job. They're not a judge anymore. So the stakes are really big. So what you shouldn't assume is they don't want the job, because everyone who's on the retention ballot really wants their job. They filled out forms to be able to run again. Some of them could have retired if they didn't want to do this, but there are judicial canons or ethics rules that say you cannot form a campaign committee and raise money and do things unless, if you're a candidate for retention, you've met active opposition. So there would have to be some sort of effort, and I'll talk in a second here about what happened in Iowa. There has to be some sort of active opposition. Otherwise, you're not to have a campaign committee and raise money. And as far as I know, there's not active opposition to anybody. And so that's why you haven't seen that in Indiana for any of the candidates. Some people, one student, when I said, how did you vote? He said, I voted for everybody because none of them were involved in the White Castle shooting. So you maybe remember, a year or two ago, a couple of judges were involved in a shooting at White Castle. Those judges are not on the retention ballot. They are in a county in southern Indiana that has a partisan election. One of them has an opponent, one of them doesn't. You maybe also heard a couple years ago about sentencing for a Stanford student who was convicted of sexual assault, and he got 6 months, and there was a lot of public outrage. That judge ended up being recalled in California. But I think most judges would say no press is good press when it comes to retention elections. Usually, if the press picks up on a story, it's because it's something negative. And so if you haven't heard something about a judge, I think most judges would say that's a good thing, and they feel better about the chances of being retained. In Iowa in 2010, there was an effort, a well-funded effort with TV ads and all sorts of things to not retain 3 of the justices. The year before, the court had unanimously ruled in favor of same-sex couples, saying that they were able to get married despite statute in Iowa. They found that violated the Iowa Constitution. And this was a long time ago when public views about same-sex marriage were different. And in Iowa, by kind of 55 to 45%, the 3 justices on the ballot were all voted out. That's a rare sort of instance, and not from Indiana, again, where there's been a retention election where folks have lost. So beyond the Supreme Court and Court of Appeals, Indiana has 92 counties. 3 of those have, I have Marion listed twice here. 3 of those counties have retention elections: Marion, Lake, and St. Joe. Vanderburgh County, which is Evansville, has a nonpartisan election. And then everywhere else has partisan elections. And when we talked yesterday about preparing this, we discussed Hamilton County, and I went and looked on Hamilton County has a few judges up. They don't have opponents. And so if you're voting in Hamilton County, you can vote or not vote for the judges. It's not going to matter as long as they get 1 vote. The judges on the ballot, who all happen to be Republicans in Hamilton County, will be elected. And that's true most places in the state. If you're in a county and you're a lawyer, probably not going to be real likely to run against a judge unless you think you have a decent chance of winning. You're gonna have to raise money, and the incumbent judge, if they're doing a decent job, it's probably going to be hard to win that. So there a lot of times aren't a lot of contested judicial races. There are looking around Indianapolis, in Madison County, I know there are a few of them that are partisan that have general election opponents, but most don't. And so Marion County, I want to just talk about briefly, because I assume most people, or a lot of people who are at IUPUI, live in Marion County, and I live in Marion County. This picture is of the judicial selection committee in Marion County. It has 14 members. Some are lawyers, some are not lawyers. It's chaired by Justice Massa from the Supreme Court. And this group of people meets to interview and then send 3 names to the governor when there's an opening. And then what they're also charged with doing in a retention year, at least the first time a judge is up for retention, is reviewing applications from the judges and making a recommendation. And so I'm not going to click on it. I can tell you what it says. It's not, there's not a lot to it, but they interviewed all 13 judges who are up for retention and recommended unanimously. All 14 members voted that they should all be retained. You can make your own sort of assessment. And so I did a public records request. I've got the retention applications from all of the judges on the ballot, and we posted that, or I know Jenny posted that on the blog. So if you look at the second link here, it'll take you to a blog post from IUPUI, which has a link to all the retention applications. So if you want to read more about anyone who's up for retention, if you want to read about their summaries before the committee, there's a link there to the Indiana Lawyer, which I don't think the Indianapolis Star or most local media cover this, but the Indiana Lawyer, which is a newspaper in town, did sort of write summaries of this. So if you're looking for more information about the Marion County applicants, you can see that they were recommended by this 14-member committee. That's Democrats, Republicans, people who come from all different sort of walks of life, lawyers and non-lawyers, but you can look for yourself if you want to read more about them at the applications, which are linked there. More information about elections, that's the blog post I mentioned, and then ballot ready and vote 411 are recommendations. And so with that, I open it up to your questions, and I thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Professor Schumm. Does anybody have any questions? You can type them in the chat box, but if not, I had a question I wanted to ask. Do you think in the future they're going to continue having retention elections, or do you think that Marion County might, transition to those partisan elections?
I think it's probably likely in Marion County that we'll still have retention elections. So the General Assembly gets to decide. The General Assembly is either supermajority or very close to supermajority Republican. If there were partisan elections in Marion County, I think everybody would tell you, Democrats or Republicans or uninterested people, that Democrats would probably win all of those judgeships if you had a partisan election. And so the system we have now with merit selection, and we didn't talk about this, but there's written in the statute, there has to be, there can't be more than 52% of judges from one political party. That's written into the statute. And so I wouldn't look for the General Assembly to change that for Marion County, because the General Assembly is quite Republican, Marion County is not. And so for that reason, just a pure sort of political reason, I wouldn't expect that to happen. And the idea, I think, behind this is in bigger counties, which we have merit selection and retention elections in most bigger counties, is it's hard to, if you had to make decisions about 15 judges, I mean, they're up for retention, but if you had candidates and you were trying to make an assessment other than just voting a straight party ticket, it would be hard to sort of research all that. And do you really want judges out raising money? If judges raise money, they're probably going to be raising it from lawyers. Those lawyers sometimes appear before them. So I would not look for Marion County to change. I think what could maybe change is maybe some other large counties might go to a system like this. There hasn't been a push, though, to do this in a big sort of way in Indiana. It's really just a few counties that have this system.
All right. And then there are a couple more questions in the chat box. I don't know if you can see them, Professor.
I can, let's see. Is the first one from Ben?
Yes.
Is there any way to summarize or categorize the information displayed on the link below that may draw high-level conclusions from it? If a particular judge regularly gave sentences above or below, a particular judge size of a corporation. That's a great question. I wish there was. I wish there were entities that did some of that, or better yet, that we had these judicial performance evaluations that some states have, where they do surveys of litigants. But no, I don't think there's a way to do that. And sentencing in particular, it's tough to, I mean, I guess you could look at where things are from the average, but from the information that's in the links I have, I don't think you'd be able to do that. You'd have to spend a lot of time to do that. And I don't know of any group that's done those things. And I don't know, to sort of the second question, if, I mean, there are groups of lawyers who do mostly plaintiffs work or defense work who would have a preference of, some judges, and there's lawyers on this selection committee, one from the trial lawyers and one from the defense trial counsel. So they're on opposite sides of that review the applicants. I don't think either of those groups comes out and recommends for or against retention or provides this kind of information about how judges rule in those cases. So no, and if you look at the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court opinions, it's all of them. So it's, if you pick one, you don't know that that's really necessarily representative of how the judge may sort of write or decide cases more broadly. And then Jennifer's question, many people seem to be basing their votes on whether someone was appointed by Democrat or Republican. Is that a fair way to make a judgment? I'm not here to sort of preach or cheerlead. I don't think that's a great way to make the decision. In Indiana, there's a mix because some of the judges in the Court of Appeals have been around since the 1990s when there were Democratic governors. Everyone in the Indiana Supreme Court right now was appointed by a Republican governor. They don't decide cases 5-0 a lot of times. It's not like the US Supreme Court where you have some issues that seem to divide between, liberals or conservatives or however you want to characterize the views. The kind of issues that come up in state court don't cut that way. And I would try to base it more on, if you look at those retention applications, if you get a sense of, does this person treat people fairly? Do they work hard? What kind of activities are they involved in? Some of those things. I think it'd be, and basing it just on one opinion is sometimes not, it can be problematic too. You want to try to think of everything the judge has done. But, one way to make a determination is to look at who appointed the judges. But I think most judges pride themselves on not being partisan. And I mentioned those judicial canons, they limit what judges are able to do once they're in office. And so I can tell you, as someone who does criminal defense work at the appellate level, that the judges whose decisions I'm happy with, it doesn't divide by DNR a lot of times. It's otherwise. And overall, I think that they do a good job and they're very conscientious about the work that they do. Any other questions? I don't see any others in the chat. I will say, some of you may find this interesting, at least in 2018, some people, when they voted in Marion County, at least a fair number of people, at least probably would have been a few hundred for this to show up this way, voted for all the female judicial candidates. And if you look, because if you look at the results, all the women who were up for retention as judges had more votes than all the men were. Again, it was over 80%. It did make a difference to who ended up winning, but that was a criteria some were using. From Kathy, you mentioned judicial performance reviews. Are those likely to happen in Indiana? I thought a couple years ago there was talk of that. I don't know that that anything's really happened with that. I think it becomes difficult if you want to do them right. There should be some funding to be able to oversee them, and you don't have to necessarily have judges on board, but it'd be nice if judges were on board. The thing I like about judicial performance reviews is, let's say there is opposition to a judge because of a decision they made. Let's say it was a decision they made that was the right decision, that they suppressed some evidence in a criminal case, but it meant that this person couldn't be tried for a really serious crime because the police obtained the evidence illegally. There could be a retention sort of, or a political campaign against that person, and they could say, look, this horrible person that was arrested for this crime got off because of this. It would be nice if we had judicial performance evaluations. Then we could say, how's this person ruled in cases? How do they treat people? we could look at those kind of criteria instead of basing a decision on one thing. I mentioned Iowa, those justices were lost because of their ruling on one case that I would think now in 2020, almost everyone thinks is the right ruling, but in 2010 with a 30-second political ad and some money raised, they ended up losing as a result of that.
Brittany also put a question in the chat. She said, what would be a red flag for you to not retain a judge, and how would one find that information?
So I think one red flag would be the lawyer poll. If you saw that the members of the state bar, even if it was 55 or 60% said retain, that would be a big percentage of lawyers who presumably know some things about the judge. If a judge had really serious ethical opinions, which none of the judges up have any of those things, and there is a body in the Supreme Court can discipline judges and can remove judges from the bench. But even if someone was suspended for a long period of time because of ethical lapses, that to me would be a red flag. If a judge just isn't doing their work, if they have a huge backlog, if they treat people really badly, those things though should come out with lawyer poll, with the Judicial Selection Committee in Marion County that reviews those things. Hopefully do get show up because of that. And one thing that'll happen as well is sometimes judges won't run for retention. I would think if there was a big sort of red flag, if something had happened with a judge and they'd been suspended for a long time, or there'd been a big controversy, they maybe decide not to run. And so, and I don't think that's the case with the judges who've recently retired, but that's some places what's happened as well. So those would be some red flags I'd look for. Are there any other questions? I think have we gotten to all of them?
I think those might be all the questions. So if nobody has any more questions, we can, go ahead and oh, sorry, somebody commented, the retention website you provide is very helpful. Thank you. Well, thank you for coming, Laura. And thank you, Professor Schumm, for presenting and sharing your expertise. I mean, I personally learned a lot about Indiana's judicial system, and I think all of the resources you provide were really helpful. So thank you for your time. And thank you, everyone, for spending your Thursday evening with us and learning a little bit about judicial retention.
Great. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Yes, I have all your emails, so I can also email links to you all.